So where and when were you born?
I was born in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, back in the early 70s. It's been a little while.
And what's your astrological sign?
Libra.
Wonderful. So far, a lot of people are Aquarians, which makes sense because they're visionary, forward-thinking. So I'm looking for patterns in that. And do you know your Myers-Briggs or your Enneagram type?
I did a Myers-Briggs test many years ago. Back then I was an INTP. But this changes over time, and I certainly have changed a lot, even over the last 10 years, let alone over the last 20 years. So I'm not sure I would have the same type.
Well, the one I'm interested in is the N, and everybody is an N. No one is a sensing. So I love it when my hypothesis is carried out. So, as I said, the focus of this book is examining a new paradigm in science, which some people have said is like the third Copernican revolution. And it has to do with non-materialism. So my question to you is, do you agree there's a new paradigm in science? And do you agree that it's defined by being idealistic rather than materialistic?
Well, materialism versus idealism versus panpsychism versus dualism, all these isms, they are philosophical positions. In principle, science can be done in a way that is entirely agnostic of any ontological interpretation of reality, because science is about how nature behaves. It's about the regularities of nature's behavior as far as we can observe. If we do set up conditions in this way and you run a system, then that happens. No, this is behavior. Science, the method of science itself has nothing to say about what things intrinsically are that transcends the method of science. It's not a method that was created to assess what things are in and by themselves.
So hence the saying, shut up and quantify.
That's one. Yeah, okay. The climax of this aspect of science has been encoded in this phrase, and shut up and calculate. But science is about behavior, and of course you can infer many things about what things are based on their behavior, but you can't really make an assertion about what they are. Science is a relative method. It's about the behavior of one thing in respect to another. So what things essentially are, is this all mind? Is this all matter outside mind? Is this all ungrounded information, like pan-computationalists would say? These are philosophy questions. The problem is that science has come to be very tightly identified with one particular metaphysics, the metaphysics of materialism or mainstream physicalism, to the point that people even scientists start conflating science with materialism, as if materialism were essential for science. It is not. You can do science under idealism, under panpsychism, under pan-computationalism, all these other approaches to the essential nature of reality. Now, the question then is, do I recognize that at least in some corners of science there is a change in the way, in the metaphysical assumptions that scientists make? Well, clearly, a lot of scientists are open to non-materialist views. Whether this is a new phenomenon or whether this has been going on for a long time and people were just in the closet and not talking about it, and now with social media and the internet it's more visible, I don't know. Maybe it is a new phenomenon. I tend to believe that there has been an acceleration of this, that people now think more carefully about materialism and identify more easily its shortcomings, what's difficult about it, and are therefore more open to alternatives. But the jury's out there. The jury is still out, I mean.
Well, what's interesting to me, that the notion of idealism, that mind is primary and matter follows from mind, has been around since 480 BC in Greece, and Hindus talk about Atman, our inner core that's is like Brahman, that will kind of evolve into this oneness that you talk about in some of your books. So I'm wondering, there's nothing new about this.
Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Idealism as a metaphysics has been around for a long time. It's a matter of how well articulated it is, how well substantiated on an empirical basis it is, how complete it is articulated in the sense that if you're an idealist, you should be able to explain obvious facts of reality in terms of an ontology that postulates that there is only one consciousness in the universe, including the fact that I can't read your thoughts, at least ordinarily, and you can't read mine, that we all seem to inhabit the same universe, the same world outside our personal or individual mentation, that we can't change this universe by a mere act of volition, the way we can change the imagery that we imagine ourselves with a mere act of volition. So we have to explain all that. And the question is how well articulated idealism has been in different moments in the history of mankind, of humankind, in order to address all these questions. How complete has been the articulation? But idealism itself has been around forever.
Was it Descartes who separated spirit and matter? Where do you trace the beginning of that science is materialist?
Well, Descartes tried to bring peace between science and the church by carving out the world between mind and matter and saying, okay, mind or spirit, we leave that for the church, but then in turn the church should leave us alone and not burn us at the stake anymore if we focus on the material part of this dualism. I mean, there has been many motivations for this divide, many of which are not based on good philosophical or scientific arguments. They were more, socio-political at the time. And
so when do you trace the beginnings of this current wave that you're surfing of idealism?
Well, idealism has been very much in vogue at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century with German idealism. Names like Hegel come to mind, Schopenhauer, who certainly was an idealist, not a panpsychist. I'm writing a book making this case right now. And then there came a wave of materialism, Darwin, towards the end of the 19th century, Nietzsche proclaiming that God was dead, and things went from there to logical positivism. The idea that all that you can really know is what you apprehend through your senses, that logic is the Aristotelian logic is the basis of all knowledge. We got then into existentialism, the idea that whatever meaning there is in nature is projected by us, it's made by us, and it's not really intrinsic to nature out there. And science has been so successful in enabling technology, and at the same time has been so much associated with this particular metaphysics of materialism, that the success of science in our technology turn in the 1960s and 70s, the computer revolution of the 90s, the internet, that materialism began to really rule the waves in the second half of the 20th century. But perhaps because of that, people started thinking more carefully about materialism and its intrinsic ability to explain the qualities of experience, what it feels like to see the color red, what it feels like to fall in love, to be disappointed, what it feels like to have a bellyache. And people realized that whichever way you twist and turn materialism, you fundamentally cannot make sense of the qualities of experience. So it's at least incomplete, most likely wrong and discardable. And that's a thing of the very late 90s and beginning of the 21st century, and it's being articulated and explicated and exfoliated over the last 2 decades or so.
Before we go into the proofs that materialism isn't enough, you say in Materialism is Baloney that you have the freedom to discuss these issues because you're not in academia. What is it about academia that is so straitjacketing?
Well, when you are an academic, that's your profession, and you are evaluated every year for your performance, and your performance will be measured based on the papers you published, where they have been published, how you are judged by your peers, And from that perspective, you have to fit into the general, more or less, consensus. You have to fit into the current value system in order to have a career and put food on the table and have some degree of social and economic success. I don't have that. My day job is corporate strategy in the high-tech sector. I am judged by how much money I made for the companies I work for. And my employers don't care what my philosophical and scientific positions are, insofar as they don't relate to my work. So I don't have that limitation. I don't have to fit into the current value system. I don't have to make my peers like me. I write what I want, what I believe in, what I think is correct. And guess what? I also publish a lot in quite some significant journals. So the peers recognize it ultimately. If you dare to say it, you are recognized.
A lot of people are talking about your Scientific American articles, and they say, "Oh, he was in Scientific American." So,
well, I'm glad about that. And Scientific American is a great magazine, but it's not amongst the ones I meant. What I meant was academic journals, where you go through peer review. Scientific American is a science popularization magazine, a very good one, perhaps the only really good one today. But it's not an academic journal. But yes, I'm a part of me is surprised that Scientific American has published so much of my stuff recently, because what I submit to them is very explicitly anti-materialism. It's just well articulated, I hope, well substantiated, and Scientific American has proven that its editorial crew is honest and open-minded, and truly evaluate what they get based on the quality of the articulation and the substantiation, and not based on some preconceptions. So that was very heartening to see. I'm very happy with Scientific American.
Right. I know I interviewed Brian Josephson, who, as you know, won the Nobel Prize in Physics, and he said he really does have trouble getting articles published in peer-reviewed magazines. So having a Nobel Prize didn't overcome the prejudice in some of those journals. You say that some of the old assumptions, the material assumptions, are making us collectively mad, and we're in a collective trance. Could you comment on how we're collectively mad?
Well, the life we live effectively is a consequence also of our belief system. What we experience of the world is not only a function of the world as it is, it's a function of what we project onto the world based on our belief system, what we make of what we experience, not the experience per se only. And if we adopt a materialist metaphysics, and we think that all there is unconscious matter, and that consciousness is this ephemeral little epiphenomenon, this little spark that you get when matter by chance, by accident, arranges itself into specific configurations, which we call a living brain. And once that configuration sort of loses its integrity, its internal structure and coherence, in other words, when you die, that consciousness just disappears. If you believe that, then, after you're dead, you're gone. You have nothing to lose about what happens to the world 100 years from now. You'll be dead. Let the whole thing blow up. You don't care. The only possible meaning, conceivable meaning in life is to accumulate material goods, because matter is all that exists. So there is nothing else conceivable for you to set as a goal, as a meaning, as a purpose to pursue in life, other than to accumulate material goods. Our emotions become secondary, become epiphenomenal. They become mere shadows of brain activity that have a survival purpose. Oh, and by the way, you also happen to feel bad. So we might as well repress all of our emotions, because they have no intrinsic meaning anyway. They are just an accident of certain programs encoded by evolution to favor survival and reproduction. So we never live a examined life. because we are always dissociated. We are always disintegrated, so to say. Our emotions are always buried away because we don't care about them, instead of having a examined life, a life where we try to integrate every aspect of ourselves, our emotions, our thoughts, our aspirations, our sense of purpose and meaning, and so forth. So by having materialism as the mainstream storyline about what's going on, about what the world is and about what we are and our role in life, we become collectively mad because of the implications of that belief system. We become disconnected from our own nature. I mean, what are we if not consciousness? If we were not conscious, what would we be? It wouldn't matter, because there would be nobody conscious to care about it anyway. But materialism says that consciousness is just an epiphenomenon. It's a secondary effect, a consequence of something else that is much more fundamental. So what kind of life can we live under this belief system? It's certainly a life of madness in which we are disconnected from our own nature, from the ground of our being, which is consciousness, which is to experience the qualities of life in the sense of qualia, in the sense of the emotions we experience, the perceptions we have, how we relate to the world, and so forth.
We're certainly destroying the planet, so I think the proof is in the pudding.
Yes, because if when you die you're gone, then what do you care whether the planet will be okay 100, 200, 500 years from now? It's abstract to you. It becomes of no consequence. What matters is what's going to happen in the couple of next decades that we have to live. And if the price of making the most of that is to wreck the planet for the coming countless generations, then so be it, because we are not going to be there to care. If you believe that, this behavior is logical, but it's also mad.
Well, and it also forgets that they have children and grandchildren, which evolution says you care about your genes being passed on. So evolutionary-wise, you would want your grandchildren to be able to survive to pass on your genes.
The question is to what extent is our more metacognitive behavior, our behavior as given as triggered by motives as opposed to instincts. To what extent is that behavior a function of our belief system as gathered by culture, by social interactions, or by biological programming? I think our need to have sex, for instance, is certainly biologically programmed. But the choices we make about how we consume, for instance, I think to some extent at least, the motives behind that are cultural artifacts. They are derived from a belief system that we to some extent inherit from the culture, and then to some extent we make up ourselves based on our dispositions and patterns of thinking and so forth. I think for most people, their great-great-grandchildren are completely abstract. It's not important for most people at the felt level what's going to happen to your great-great-grandchildren. It's too abstract. It's too far removed. You're never going to meet them. You're never going to know them anyway. And even people who do care all the way to their grandchildren, at the end of the day, I don't know because I don't have children myself. But I think there is a schism. There is a split in people's minds, because part of them certainly care, but there is another part of them that kicks in when they're making these short-term choices that is dissociated from the first part, and they make those choices that will end up wrecking the planet anyway. And they can even rationalize that by saying, well, I need to accumulate wealth so I can leave something from my children and my grandchildren so they are successful in life. But that's thinking at a very local scale, optimizing for the local scale, and wrecking everything at a global scale.
Absolutely. So I think what you're saying that's new is that we need a new language. It could be art, it could be poetry, to understand reality, and we can look at seemingly absurd phenomena like ET abductions or, you know, telepathy or remote viewing, and look at them and see what we can learn from them, and acknowledge that the personal experience has efficacy. So that seems to be a contribution that you're making. Do you agree that's kind of view?
I'm not sure that anything I'm saying is completely original. I suspect very strongly that nothing I am saying is really, really original. But well, it's a contribution nonetheless, at least in the sense that it was articulated in a different way. I think logic is very important. I think if we get rid of logic, then it's pandemonium. Logic is important at a cultural and social level. Logic is important for the development of the predictive models of science, which enable technology, and technology is important.
Trump
can also wreck the planet.
Trump shows what happens when we don't value logic.
There you go. At the same time, the fact that logic is very important because it's so useful and seems to work for practical purposes, that doesn't necessarily mean that it reflects completely what reality really is, what nature really is at an essential, fundamental level. It may be a window into nature, a very empirically effective window with very many practical applications. But to translate what works into what is a big step. Moreover, logicians themselves have a variety of different logics. In other words, they adopt a variety of different sets of axioms, self-evident truths, so to say, to base their logical thinking. And there is no clarity about which logic is correct. They are just different choices. Maybe none is correct, in the sense that none is fundamentally correct. Why would nature obey because logic is based on axioms. For instance, if I say that A equals B, and B equals C, then it follows that A equals C. Or if something is true, it cannot be false. And if it's false, it cannot be true. So these are the axioms of logic, and they come from our way of thinking. You cannot use logic to prove that logic is correct, because the moment you do that, you're begging the question. That's circular reasoning. So for all we know, nature doesn't follow logic at a fundamental level. It's just that logic happens to work most of the time, if not always. But there can be other logics that are also equally consistent with nature. Intuitionistic logic, for instance. So what the idea that I bring up is that we shouldn't become too focused on one particular logic, Aristotelian logic, just because it's our cultural and intuition, the intuition of our civilization. There are other logics, and nature itself, although it seems to comply with Aristotelian logic, perhaps because that's what we expect it to do, nature itself may be fundamentally absurd. And Professor Graham Priest has been making this case for a while now. And what we see of nature may be just an aspect of it that complies with our expectations about it, because that's how our cognitive system has been put together, to perceive nature in a certain way that complies with the rules built into our cognitive system. That's why the world seems to reflect our axioms of thought so well, because that's how we perceive it as a function of our cognitive system. I think we should be more open-minded when it comes to the more fundamental questions of what nature essentially is.
Well, the quantum physicists in the early 20th century said it's weird, it's spooky, and Einstein said it's spooky. So they all described quantum mechanics as weird and odd and maybe not logical.
Well, the spooky action at a distance is not necessarily a logical thing. There has been a lot of papers, a lot of academic work done on whether logic is empirical or not, and if it is empirical, what does quantum mechanics have to say about logic from an empirical perspective? A lot has been discussed and debated about it. So yes, you do have a point, yeah.
So just to kind of give an example of you can use art or metaphor or experience to understand reality. You gave an example in one of your books as people who had an ET were abducted. So what does that tell us? How do we use that to make sense of what seems spooky?
Okay, let me make first a clarification. The so-called alien abduction phenomenon, to me, is an instance of what people tend to call a high strangeness experience. I don't necessarily think, actually, I don't think that alien abductions are literally true in the sense that some metal spaceships from another star system came to this planet and physically lifted somebody up into the sky and performed medical experiments and then transported this person back. I don't think it would be nice if the explanation were so simple and so pedestrian, right? That our logic would still survive, our physics would still survive, our metaphysics would still survive. I think what these high strangeness experiences are telling us is that there is a world of consensus that follows the axioms of logic as we expect them to hold because of the way our cognitive system has been put together. But there is an underlying layer of reality that doesn't necessarily comply to that. That nature at its core, at its deeper layers, below the crust, so to say, has many, many more degrees of freedom than our logical and physical intuitions would grant it. And that in certain states of consciousness, certain strange, abnormal, non-ordinary states of consciousness, people can cognize those deeper layers, those layers that do not comply with logic and physics as we understand it today.
So what would be another explanation of why someone, and Harvard researcher, I've forgotten his name, has done a lot of research on the abductees, and I think he's convinced that it really happened. Why would they have those perceptions in a repeated pattern of different individuals?
Yeah, that professor would be John E. Mack,
right,
who died 15 years ago this year. John used to talk about ontological shock as a feature of the experience of his patients. And ontological shock is when you are confronted with experiences that contradict your belief system about the metaphysics that should hold. And I think he was correct. This reflects ontological shock in the sense that these people gain access to a layer of reality that is ordinarily hidden from us, ordinarily hidden from the way our cognitive system weaves reality together to enable our survival. And that deeper layer does not comply with the axioms of logic or the metaphysics of materialism. And how people get access to that? Well, as you know, I'm an idealist. I think all of reality, all the layers of this onion that we call reality are mental. They are essentially mental. They are just cognitive layers layered upon each other. So I think when people access through a high strangeness experience a layer of reality that sounds absurd, that is absurd from our perspective here in our ordinary mode of consciousness, they are indeed accessing mental activity. So their experience is indeed mental.
But is it just their imagination?
It is mental, but not necessarily only their personal imagination. You see, when I say that everything is mental, I don't mean that it's only your mentation or only my mentation.
It's like
I'm alluding to
collective unconscious and the archetypes we share.
Yeah, I don't like the word unconscious, but yes, I'm referring to transpersonal mentation, which would correspond to the Jungian collective unconscious. So I think their experience, their high strangeness experience, is mental. But I think our ordinary experience right now, my talking to you right now, is also mental. It's transpersonal, but it is also mental. I think all the layers of the onion are mental. And I think that's what John Mack was getting to, but unfortunately he left us before he could more fully articulate it.
We'll have to find a medium and interview him on the other side. So are you saying that those people are having an experience with an extraterrestrial, or that they're tapping into some kind of archetype of ET, that they share this archetype?
I'm not fond of literal explanations. I think everything we experience is fundamentally symbolic. Even our physical world of ordinary everyday life is eminently symbolic, I think. So I don't think the alien spaceships are literally true. I don't think the aliens are literally aliens from another star system. I think that's a symbolic system that is trying to evoke something much deeper than any literal narrative could grasp, could capture.
So is archetype a fair word? They're seeing an archetype, tapping into?
It's a fair word, but let's say yes, they are seeing an archetype. I mean, what does it add to the story, right? Archetypes, according to Jung, are the basic templates according to which mind manifests itself. From that perspective, a symbolic system is, of course, based on archetypes, because all manifestations of mind have to follow its basic templates. Mind is not a chaotic, arbitrary system with random behavior. It behaves according to certain dispositions, to certain tendencies. And these dispositions, tendencies, or regularities, or templates of manifestation are what Jung called archetypes. So yes, from that perspective, that symbolic experience is based on archetypes. Sorry about my cat interfering with the interview.
Oh no, it's great. It makes me think of how the random number generators get more coherent when the world mind is focused on an event like the World Trade Tower bombings or Princess Di's funeral. So that seems to indicate that even inanimate objects respond to mind, to thought.
Yeah, I don't think inanimate objects exist as such. I think the partitioning of the inanimate world into separate objects is an epistemic thing. It's something we do. We divide the inanimate world into objects for our own convenience. We impose that division onto the inanimate world. What's the difference between a mountain and a rock on that mountain? Isn't the rock just part of the mountain? Yeah, but if it detaches and bounces down the slope of the mountain, is it a different object? I mean, where does the river end and the ocean begin? I mean, is the handle intrinsically part of the cup? Mm-hmm. Or maybe is the hood not part of the jacket? It just happens to be connected to it. You see, we divide the world into separate objects purely nominally. It's an arbitrary partitioning based on convenience. You can even say that a car is a separate object because, if you say that the spark plugs are part of the car because without the spark plugs the car wouldn't work, well, then you need the gasoline in the fuel tank to be part of the car. You need the road to be part of the car because without the road there's nothing for the tires to grip. Well, you need gravity to be part of the car because without gravity the tires wouldn't grip the road. And there you go, now off you are. Well, where does the car end? So I don't think inanimate objects exist to begin with. It's just what we project onto the world. But I do think the inanimate world as a whole is the extrinsic appearance of conscious inner life. Just in the way your brain and its activity is the extrinsic appearance of your personal conscious inner life, I think the inanimate universe as a whole is the extrinsic appearance, the image of transpersonal conscious inner life. The inner life of Brahman, if you want to use Hindu terminology.
So does that mean the ring or the random number generator or the car has consciousness? I mean, can you define, is consciousness sounds like it's equals mind. So does I
think the inanimate universe as a whole is the image of conscious activity. It's the way transpersonal conscious activity looks like from our perspective. So I don't think it has consciousness in the sense that it is not an entity that possesses consciousness as one of its properties. I think it's just the way conscious activity looks like. It doesn't have consciousness. It is consciousness. It is the appearance, the extrinsic appearance of consciousness. That's what I think is going on.
Okay, so consciousness, define it, it's more than mind. If everything is consciousness, then it's more than mind.
It depends on how you use the words. in Eastern philosophy, people tend to translate the words differently. So mind has more to do with cognitive activity, with thoughts, in which there is a subject separate from its object, and the subject acquires knowledge of its object.
Right.
And then mind is only that, so that equates mind to cognition, to thought, apprehension of knowledge. In the Western tradition, mind, spirit, and consciousness have been used for a long time interchangeably. I tend to use the words mind and consciousness interchangeably, except in psychology papers, because there I need to make this distinction, because consciousness does not necessarily entail cognition. Consciousness does not necessarily entail a split between object and subject. If you're talking about consciousness pure, then you're talking about what it is likeness. In other words, something is conscious if there is something it is like to be that thing, that entity. Then the entity is conscious. You can be conscious in this way without having any conceptualization of objects. You can just feel. If there is something it is like to be you, then you're conscious, whether you have cognition or not, whether you have metacognition or not. I think at underlying nature, there is consciousness in the way I just described, what it is likeness, the existence of qualities of experience, not necessarily cognition or metacognition. I think cognition and metacognition are the product of life, of living beings. Living beings have developed cognition and metacognition, at least in our case, the ability to think about our own thoughts. I think this is a property of living beings, maybe even higher living beings. But underlying the universe as a whole, maybe the inanimate universe, there is certainly consciousness. There is something it is like to be the inanimate universe as a whole. But the inanimate universe does not necessarily cognize or metacognize. It does not necessarily think deliberately. It probably unfolds according to very regular, predictable, instinctual patterns of thought or archetypes, universal archetypes.
It seems that you agree with Jung that the aim of life is to become whole, which he said is to become conscious of the unconscious. Because you talk about mind at large is trying to find this kind of self-awareness or self-reflection. Is that an accurate statement?
That's an accurate statement, with the caveat that Jung used the word consciousness virtually always as a synonym of what we would today call metaconsciousness. In other words, conscious metacognition. Let me explain the difference. To be conscious, for an entity to be conscious, there just needs to be something it is like to be the entity. The entity only needs to feel something, and then it's already conscious. To be metaconscious, you not only need to feel something, you need to know that you feel. You need to know that you experience. You need to be aware of an experience explicitly. You need to be able to introspect and know that you're having that experience. So when Jung talks about consciousness, he's talking about our ability to access an experience introspectively, metacognitively. I mean, you can see that clearly in an essay he wrote in 1932, I believe, the Stages of Life, in which he talks about how children develop consciousness over their first years of life. Well, of course, he couldn't have meant by that children do not have experiential states, that babies do not have experiential states, that toddlers do not have experiential states. Of course they do, but they are not aware that they have experiential states. That awareness that you experience develops over time, and that's called metacognition. So, finally, I'll answer your question now. I agree with Jung that the ultimate goal of life is to develop this explicit introspective awareness of everything we actually experience, of everything we actually feel, to become metacognitive of the whole universe of our inner experience, of our inner feeling, and be able to then realize that that is what you are experiencing. That is what I am experiencing. That is me. This is what's going on in me. That realization, which is the outcome of the process of individuation, I do see as the ultimate goal, not only of life, but the ultimate universal goal as well, universal individuation happening through us.
So you could use the word God to describe that universal consciousness and evolution in consciousness, awareness.
It's fine. As far as I'm concerned, it's a fine word, has a lot of historical tradition, carries a lot of meaning because of that, and that's what gives value to that word. But it's a word that needs to be used very carefully because it carries a lot of baggage as well. And if I just say, yes, it's God, then people might think that I mean by this that there is a God that is deliberate, that has a plan, that knows exactly what he's doing at a metacognitive level. I don't think that to be the case. I think metacognition is something that we have brought into existence in nature. We are nature's way of developing metacognition. God itself, as the underlying universal consciousness, is metacognitive, perhaps only to the extent that we are as aspects of it. I don't think there is a deliberate universal plan, all planned out and scheduled nicely, the way you would plan a vacation, for instance. I don't think that's what's going on. I think in nature itself, beyond us, unfolds in a fairly instinctual manner. It unfolds according to the directions provided by its universal archetypes, which are instinctual developments, instinctual unfoldings, so to say. And that's why nature is so predictable. That's why nature can be modeled scientifically so well in such a reliable manner.
I'm thinking of people who had near-death or astral travel experiences like Eben Alexander and Robert Monroe, and it seems that what they came away with is God as love, as this big feeling state, love and joy, and but not so much logic or planning.
Yes, I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I think there is something to that.
Let's talk about the evidence that you develop in your books and articles about idealism is really accurate. So one kind of point that you make is that in experiences like using psychedelics or brain injury, or where the brain is impaired in some ways, that they have these enormous experiences, but the brain is not what you'd think has more activity but less. So that seems to indicate that there are experiences that are somehow independent of neurons firing.
Yes, I think, let me just get rid of my cat before I answer your question, because he's on my case. We didn't have time to cover that yet, so let me give you just a brief introduction to base what I'm about to say. I think living creatures are dissociated complexes of universal consciousness, in a sense analogous to how a person with dissociative identity disorder has multiple alters, multiple alternative personalities, so to say, different centers of consciousness.
And one alter could have diabetes and the other not, and one alter could wear glasses and the other not. So to me, that's like the best evidence of the power of personality and consciousness over the physical.
There certainly is very objective evidence about there being dissociated alters of experience. We have objective fMRI scan measurements, we have objective EEG measurements of that. So I think this provides a very nice analogy about what may be going on at a universal level. I think at a universal level there is universal consciousness, and it is dissociating itself into alters. And the extrinsic appearance of an alter, what an alter looks like from across its dissociative boundary, is what we call a living organism. So I am an alter of universal consciousness, you are another one, my cat is another, a bacteria is another, a tree is another. So these are the images of dissociative processes. If that is the case, if ordinary brain activity reflects not only our inner experiential states, but also the dissociative process itself, because that's what it should be if we are dissociated alters of universal consciousness, then under some circumstances, not all, but under some circumstances, an impairment of ordinary brain activity, if it touches, if it reflects an impairment of that dissociative mechanism of which it is an image, then that impairment of ordinary brain function should correlate with an expansion of consciousness as experienced from a first-person perspective. Because you see, if you're impairing dissociation, what you're doing is you're making the dissociative boundary more porous. And things can flood in from beyond the boundary.
The filter is less filtering.
That's an analogy. It's a dualist analogy that I use with care, but it's a valid analogy. If you're disrupting the dissociative boundary becomes more porous, and you begin reintegrating things that you're dissociated from. A sense of self that you've been dissociated from, memories you've been dissociated from, insights, understandings, perspectives that you've not been able to access since birth, for instance. And that would be registered subjectively as an expansion of awareness, which for materialism is very, very counterintuitive, if at all reconcilable, because for materialism, if brain activity is not only the image of dissociated inner life, but it is the cause of experience to begin with, then any reduction or impairment of brain activity, anything that puts brain activity down, should correlate with a reduction in the richness or intensity of inner experience, not an expansion. And what we have in a very wide variety of cases is this consistent correlation between certain types of brain activity impairment, brain function impairment, be it through damage, bullet wounds to the head, be it through hypoxia, be it through chemical impairment through psychedelics, be it a variety of mechanisms, trance, and they correlate with an enrichment of inner experience. And that, I think, is at least suggestive of an idealist metaphysics and contradictory with a materialist metaphysics.
You also point out that a lot of indigenous people had mystical experiences that they needed to find, like the water in the Australian outback, or find the food source, and that was associated with hardships, because they did suffer a lot of hardships. So that's another example.
Yeah, I think, if life is the image of dissociation, then the more you can secure comfort, the more you can guarantee your life, the more you can enforce your ego, the more dissociated you will be. That's basically what we've become very good at doing. We've become very good at securing the boundaries of our dissociation. The entirety of Western civilization has evolved in this direction. We make sure we have very comfortable lives, very secure lives. We eat well, more than well now. We eat too much, to the point that we are dying from eating.
Yeah.
But from the perspective of those pre-literate cultures, we eat plenty. We don't walk around with chronic illness. We don't expose ourselves to the elements anymore. We live very sheltered, safe lives. We travel around by car. We are in heated buildings or cooled buildings if you're from Australia, or in my birthplace, which I haven't visited in decades, but I remember it's very hot there. I remember as a child. And we had air conditioning in my parents' house. So we live these sheltered lives, which guarantees optimal ordinary brain function. Pre-literate cultures didn't have that. They lived a lot less sheltered lives. They were exposed to a lot more physiological stress, and I suspect that could have consistently compromised the dissociative mechanisms. So they had consistent more access to something beyond what we recognize as ordinary life, because their dissociative boundaries were consistently more porous than ours is. And they were also not insulated by the rule of culture to the extent that we are. We've developed and reinforced very much a global culture. We are told what to believe in and what not to believe in. authority figures in academia for decades or for centuries even have been telling us what's possible and what's not possible in principle. And although time and again we have realized that these decrees usually are false, that there is a lot more possible than we thought would have been. Again and again, we still decree what's possible and what's not possible. And those pre-literate cultures were, I think, less ruled by this. Their culture was more ancient, but it had less momentum. They didn't have a global civilization. They didn't have media, global media, reinforcing the same message again and again. So I think they did have access to aspects of realities that most of us in Western civilization don't even suspect exist.
What's interesting to me is that some people can access the bigger consciousness without having to do something that impairs the brain. We can meditate or go into trance, or I learned skills from the Berkeley Psychic Institute to do intuitive work. So it's possible to get rid of that filter or reduce it in ways that aren't so hazardous.
Yeah, when I say impairment of ordinary brain function, I don't mean it in the sense of injury, in the sense of toxicity. I don't mean it that way. For instance, if you do a breathing exercise of hyperventilation, you will be impairing ordinary brain function in the way I mean it, because you will be increasing the alkalinity level of your blood through hyperoxygenation, and that increased alkalinity will lead to constriction of blood vessels in your brain, which will reduce the amount of oxygen your brain gets, and therefore will impair ordinary brain function. But that doesn't mean that it's toxic. I mean, if you hyperventilate too much, you will pass out, all right? But it's not irreversible, it's not even necessarily unhealthy. It's something that you can do safely. So that's the sense in which I meant it.
But as I say, you can also just intend, I'm going to go into this other state and do, telepathy or healing from a distance or something like that, just with intention.
Yeah, I don't have experience with that.
I do.
I've never succeeded in that.
I do it all the time. Okay, then another proof of the limits of materialism is quantum mechanics, the observer effect, the entangled particles, the connection they have even if they're separated at a distance. So that's another evidence, right?
Yes, but we have to be rigorous in how we interpret this, because there's a lot of misinterpretation out there. The experiment you alluded to is the quantum entanglement experiment in which you have two entangled particles that are brought apart an arbitrarily long distance, and an observation made on the first particle has an instantaneous impact on what is observed on the other particle, even if the particles are in different opposite points of the universe. There are two ways of interpreting this, both of which would contradict the vanilla mainstream materialist metaphysics. One is to say, well, the universe is non-local. There are some global hidden properties of the universe that are sort of smeared out across all space-time.
Smeared out.
They are not localized in the particles themselves, because otherwise the particles would have to communicate at a speed greater than the speed of light, and that's impossible, we know that. So to coordinate what you experience on either measurement, you would have to assume that there is a smeared out hidden property of the universe that from behind the scenes actually connects the two particles, and what therefore you observe when you make a measurement. That's non-locality. It assumes that the particles are observed in the same physical universe. That's the motivation. This assumption is the motivation to postulate some non-local hidden property of the universe. Another interpretation is to say, well, the universe, the physical universe, has no objective existence. That's called non-realism, or defeats realism. The idea here is that things only become physically real upon observation. Only when you look at them, only when you make a measurement. before you make a measurement, before you look, things don't exist in a physically real way. They exist only as possibilities, as a realm of superposed, overlapping possibilities that are not physical in the concrete, definite way that we consider physicality to be. In other words, they don't have a definite position in space-time, they don't have definite boundaries, they don't have definite properties, definite mass, definite color, whatever. None of that. They exist only as potentialities, not as physically real entities, unless and until you look at them. Then that potentiality collapses or translates into a physically real, definite, concrete entity. Now, for a number of technical reasons related to what we call Leggett's inequalities, which have been confirmed in a 2007 study and then again in a 2010 studies, I think that the explanation for this spooky action at a distance, for this correlation between measurements made at different ends of the universe, is that the physical universe is not really physically real until we look at them. That what is out there until we look is something purely mental, is a superposition of thoughts. It's a superposition of experiential states in the way that we can hold contradictory thoughts at the same time in our minds. I think the universe at large, the inanimate universe at large, exists only as a superposition of transpersonal thoughts until we interact with it. And it's the act of this interaction between an alter and the inanimate universe that brings the physical world into existence. But if that's the case, then my physical world is essentially different from yours, because my physical world is brought into existence by my personal observation, and your physical world is brought into existence by your personal observation. And yes, you and me are immersed in the same ocean of superposed transpersonal thoughts, but it is not physical until we look at it. So my physical world, although essentially different from yours, it is consistent with yours because it arises from my interaction with the same ocean of transpersonal thoughts that you yourself are also immersed in. In other words, I am sitting in a car, you are sitting in another car, but our cars are of the same make, year, and model. So they look identical, but they are two different cars. My physical world is one car of the same make and model as your physical world, but they are different cars. Now, if you say this, you no longer need non-locality. Non-locality loses all sense, all meaning, because you see, non-locality is the idea that if Alice makes a measurement on one side of the universe, and that measurement always correlates instantaneously with a measurement that Bob makes on the other end of the universe, if you assume that Alice and Bob are in the same physical universe, then there has to be a non-locality. But if Alice has her own physical universe, and Bob has his own physical universe, although they are sharing the same transpersonal mentation, if each one is in a different physical universe, then there is no need for non-locality because they are not in the same physical universe. Everything I'm telling you is consistent with the so-called relational interpretation of quantum mechanics by a physicist called Carlo Rovelli. He proposed it in 1994. And although Carlo Rovelli is metaphysically agnostic, he's not an idealist, or he's just saying what quantum physics implies, that's all he's saying. And he acknowledges that there are some metaphysical qualms that arrive from those implications. He doesn't address those qualms. I do, and I think that those qualms require an idealist interpretation of the essence of reality to be made sense of.
But if Alice and whatever his name is, Tom's, are Bob's, how do they communicate? Why do they keep relating to each other so that Bob responds to Alice instantaneously? What good does it do to say they're in separate universes because they're still connected?
You know, in the Alice and Bob experiment, Bob will only know that his measurements were always correlated to those of Alice once he meets Alice, either directly or through some communication means under the speed of light. Only then does Bob and Alice find out, retrospectively, that their measurements were highly correlated. In other words, only when the physical world of Bob comes in contact with the physical world of Alice do they realize that what they did was highly correlated.
And they
Before
come in
that,
contact when they're measured or observed?
no, if Bob is fundamentally separate from Alice in another side of the universe, or at least sufficiently separated when they are making their measurements, during the measurement, they have no idea that they are measuring something that's correlated with what the other is doing. They have no idea, and they have no way of having an idea. Because if they know it, it means that they are in communication at subluminal speed. And therefore, the experiment is not valid. The experiment is only valid when there is no possible communication at the moment of the measurements. The measurements have to be made at the same time with a distance that is large enough to eliminate the possibility of communication between them. So Alice and Bob are never communicating when they're making measurements, when they're separate, when their physical worlds are not overlapping. But when they come together and they tell each other what they did, then they realize that there was a correlation. Yes, but then their physical worlds are in contact. I mean, Alice always has her physical world and Bob always has his physical world. They are immersed in the same ocean of transpersonal thoughts, which serves as an intermediary for messages to be sent across their respective physical worlds. It's a complex topic.
If they weren't being measured, would they still change in response to the other's change in spin? Or is the act of measurement what gives them their connection?
Quantum physics means that if you measure the spin, say, of an electron, and that electron has an entangled partner somewhere else on the other side of the universe, then whoever measures the spin of that other electron will get a result that correlates with the first measurement. So fundamentally, what it says is that those two entangled electrons cannot be looked upon as two separate physical systems. They are just different aspects of a single, unitary, indivisible physical system.
Even though they're in different worlds, so to speak.
Even though they're in different parts of the universe, they have to be treated as a single, unitary, indivisible physical system. Now, that's what quantum theory says. In other words, it's a statement about behavior. They behave in a way that cannot be separated. Their behavior is intrinsically unitary and indivisible. Now, to bring this prediction that has been confirmed about behavior into a conclusion about essence, about what the physical world essentially is, that's an exercise of philosophy. That's an exercise of interpretation. And there are many possible interpretations, all of which can be consistent with quantum mechanics as a scientific theory, all of which can be consistent with the observed and predicted behavior. You understand what I mean? My interpretation, which is consistent with the predicted observed behavior, is that Alice and Bob live in two fundamentally different physical worlds. And what they do share an environment. But that environment that is shared is not physical. It's an environment of superposed thoughts, which becomes translated to them as a physical world upon their personal observation. So the fact that Alice's and Bob's observations correlate means that there is a transpersonal environment of superposed thoughts that connects them. But what connects them is not the physical world of their measurements. It's the thing that gives rise to their respective physical worlds upon their cognitive interaction with it.
So it's not the act of being observed or measured that influences them. It's the potential that they could be. I don't understand what connects them if they're in separate places, except that they're being observed.
The separate places, when you talk about separate places, these are different places in one physical universe. But what I just said is that the physical universe of Alice is different from the physical universe of Bob. So it makes no sense to talk about separate places for Alice and Bob because they are not in the same physical universe. What makes sense to say is that they occupy separate cognitive perspectives within the ocean of transpersonal mentation in which they are immersed. But that's not a place. That's a cognitive perspective. Place entails space. Space is a property of the physical world. And Alice has one physical world and Bob has another. So within Alice's physical world, it may be valid to infer or extrapolate and say Bob is occupying another place. But in fact, he's not, because he has his own physical world. What he does have in common with Alice is that he is also immersed in the same transpersonal ocean of superposed mentation, of transpersonal thoughts. And that difference in perspective becomes cognitively translated into the respective physical world of Alice and Bob as a different position in space.
So there is some kind of mentation that connects them. Because
what connects them is transpersonal mentation. What connects them is the mind of Brahman, is the collective unconscious, right. Whatever, the Akasha, whatever name you want to call it. Yeah.
Right. Okay, I get it. As much as you can get it. The hard problem with consciousness is how conscious experience can emerge from unconscious matter, since atomic particles are thought to lack consciousness. But what you've just explained is it's not really a problem because they are part of this universal mind.
Yeah, I think the hard problem is an invention of materialism. Here we have a conscious entity who creates a conscious entity only has experience. That's all we have. All we have is experience, right? Our entire lives are made up of experiences, a series of experiences. That's all we can directly know. That's all we can be sure of. It's all we have. Everything else is a theory. Everything that is not experience is an inference of consciousness. It's consciousness trying to make sense of itself and wondering what's going on here. Why are these experiences unfolding with the patterns and regularities with which they do unfold? How can I make sense of this? How can I explain that? And then consciousness postulates this abstract entity fundamentally beyond the experience, which we call unconscious matter. Unconscious matter is a theoretical abstraction. It's a theoretical model that attempts to make sense of the regularities of experience. The problem is then, after we make this abstraction, after consciousness creates an abstraction within itself to explain things for itself, it then tries to reduce itself to that abstraction. It then tries to say, well, I, consciousness, am nothing but matter, that abstraction I just created. That's consciousness trying to reduce itself to its own abstractions. That's like chasing your own tail at light speed.
Or
it's
saying,
like trying to say,
I am my shadow.
Yeah, or a painter that paints a portrait, a self-portrait, and then points at it and say, I am that portrait. And then this painter has to face the immediate implication, which is, oh my God, how does that portrait explain my conscious inner life? Of course it doesn't. That portrait is a product of one's conscious inner life. It cannot explain one's conscious inner life any more than a painting can explain the painter. But that's the hard problem of consciousness. The hard problem of consciousness is trying to get the painting to explain the painter. And that's why it's not hard, it's impossible. It's a logical artifact of a malformed metaphysics, a hopeless metaphysics, which tries to reduce consciousness to consciousness's own abstractions. They're just chasing their own tail. So it's an inexistent problem because it arises out of an artificial and flawed line of thought to begin with. That's why it can never be solved. It's an invented problem. Like saying, well, how do I explain the painter from the painting? Well, you don't need to, guess what? You don't need to do that. The painter is what starts the whole thing. It's the starting point. Consciousness is the starting point. Consciousness is what there is. The challenge is not to explain consciousness in terms of something else, otherwise it would be just chasing your own tail. The challenge is precisely to explain everything else in terms of consciousness. That is the legitimate challenge. You explain everything else in terms of nature's soul given. What is nature's soul given? It's consciousness. It's the starting point of knowledge. It's where we all begin. The challenge is to explain the patterns and regularities of nature in terms of the patterns of excitation of consciousness itself. That is the challenge. And that's what idealism tries to do.
Got it. You imply that consciousness doesn't stop after death. Why do you conclude that?
Well, if consciousness is all there is, then life and death are things that happen within consciousness. Consciousness has nowhere to go. It's what there is. It's the scaffolding. It's the framework where things happen. Nothing can happen beyond consciousness. Consciousness has nowhere to disappear into. It's the fabric of existence. It's what exists. It's what there is. Now, personal consciousness is another matter. If we are dissociated alters of universal consciousness, it's completely reasonable to imagine that the dissociation comes to an end. The image of that end is what we call physical death. Death is what the end of dissociation looks like. That's all there is to it. What happens to the alters of a dissociative disorder patient when the patient is cured? They are all reintegrated into the host personality, and the host personality may even remember the alters. They say, oh yeah, I remember being this and being that and being that other guy or that other person. Does the consciousness of that individual cease to exist upon this cure, upon this reintegration? Of course not. It doesn't cease to exist. It never went anywhere. It was all there was, from the beginning and to the end. It's just the false sense of identity and the lapse in cognitive associations that come with dissociation. It's only that ceases to exist. I would compare that, for instance, to having a dream in which you have a certain avatar, a certain dreamed up character, having a certain life within the dream, and you think you are that avatar. During the dream, you are identified with that character. Mm-hmm. And then you wake up, and you realize that you are not, and you have never been that dreamed up character. The character, that avatar, was just a story you made up in your own mind. And by the way, even the world in which that avatar existed, that also was you. That was also a product of your dreaming mind. You were the whole thing. You were the world, you were the character, you were the other people. You were playing all the parts. I think that's what death is analogous to. When the dissociation ends, you're reintegrated into the host consciousness. You may even remember everything that happened. You went nowhere. You just remember, oh, I've never been that person to begin with. It was sort of just a dissociative process in my mind, a kind of a dream. And now I am back to what is truly real.
And that's definitely what Eastern religion says. So I think they would agree. In your new book, The Idea of the World, a multi-disciplinary argument for the mental nature of reality, you talk about hidden psychological motivations behind mainstream physicalism. What are those hidden psychological motivations? Just to keep us dumb and unquestioning and buying?
Oh, I wrote a psychology paper about it, published on Sage Open, which is quite I think it's the best read academic psychology journal in the world. And it was, I had doubts whether I could publish this paper because it was it's not tongue-in-cheek, but it is meant to be a bit of a slap. And the motivation was the following. Physicalists tend to psychologize anybody who is not a physicalist.
You say they're crazy.
they're crazy, or they are wishful thinkers, and they have their dreams and their wishes, and they confuse that with reality. Only physicalism is objective, based on facts, and it's completely dispassionate. And I thought, that's complete nonsense. There are lots of ego defense mechanisms woven around the key ideas of physicalism. Physicalism is a great story for ego reinforcement and ego defense. And I wrote a paper elaborating on all that, and guess what? It was published. I think physicalism, in surprising ways, for instance, provides us with a reassurance about death. I'll mention only a few examples. I don't think we have time to cover all the psychological motivations for physicalism here now, but death, the unknown of the experiential state beyond life on this planet, has been the greatest fear of humankind for centuries, millennia. It has been the great unknown. My God, what's going to happen to me when I die? Am I going to go to heaven? Am I going to go to hell? That has been the greatest anxiety of human beings through most of history. And physicalism does away with that with one fell swoop. It just says, you know what? All of your fears, all of your suffering, all of your pain are destined to end. Guaranteed. Your problems are guaranteed to end. All of your suffering is coming to an end. And by the way, after that, you have nothing to fear anymore, because you're not going to be there to fear. Know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it cleans the board. It does away with the greatest anxiety of mankind. And people don't realize this. Even meaning. I mean, people say, well, physicalism must be an objective perspective, because it basically turns the universe into this meaningless mechanical contraption driven by pure chance and blind laws. So it drains the meaning out of life. So you have to be a very tough, objective person to acknowledge that that's what the data is showing us, that physicalism is correct. Nonsense. Physicalism provides great avenues for meaning according to a process that in psychology is called fluid compensation. And this is empirically established. Fluid compensation is a psychological defense maneuver that everybody does when their meaning system is threatened. We derive meaning from a number of sources. From self-appreciation. If you think that you are a valuable person, you derive meaning from that. From participating in something bigger than ourselves that will survive our own death, like contributing a piece of work to civilization, through which we survive after our physical death, or eliminating doubts. When you eliminate doubts, you recover a sense of meaning. Suppose that things go terribly wrong in your life, but you understand why it went wrong. You recover meaning from that. And what fluid compensation means is that if one of these sources of meaning is threatened, you will compensate by increasing your reliance on the other sources of meaning. And you will do that, quote, unconsciously. In other words, in a non-metacognitive way. You do it almost instinctively. Religion is a source of transcendent meaning. If your religion is threatened, you will compensate by seeking meaning in another way, through closure, for instance. Physicalism is, I think, a product of late 19th century thinking, in which the death of gods, and scientists had to confront their own mortality, because now they didn't believe in God and the soul anymore. So their death, death anxiety, there's a psychological name for that. Mortality salience is the technical name psychologists give to it. Mortality salience threatens your source of transcendent meaning, because you're going to end. And I think the intellectual elite, through fluid compensation, sought other sources of meaning once that source was threatened. And what they found was, for instance, closure. I mean, I worked at CERN. We invested billions in the Large Hadron Collider in order to close the standard model of particle physics. Currently, it has no practical applications. It may never have. But we closed that model. That's closure. That's a source of meaning. It's right there. Maybe we are going to die. Yes, maybe it all comes to an end, but at least we understood what's going on. That gives you another source of meaning. That's fluid compensation right there. That's our civilization investing billions in something with no practical application just to increase our sense of closure. Or my cosmology work, all the papers I published, the books, the talks I gave, will survive my death. That's fluid compensation. You found another source of meaning. So I think materialism, through fluid compensation, provides a great sense of meaning to the people who have developed and who promote it today. The problem is that the average person on the street has no access to these other sources of meaning. The average person on the street does not understand the standard model of particle physics, and that we found the Higgs boson does not increase their sense of meaning. It's just gibberish for them. Or they are not producing cosmological work that they will leave behind. They're just doing honest, everyday jobs. Their sense of meaning is not increased by that. And that's the schism. That's the schism between people who are the ordinary people on the streets, who have no fluid compensation, who gain no access to other sources of meaning because of materialism, but have materialism imposed on them. And that just destroys the meaning of their lives. And the elites that are promoting it, because they do get other sources of meaning. But to get those sources of meaning, they have to differentiate themselves. And I think that's what we see in the culture wars today. It's this mechanism playing out. There are many other reasons why physicalism provides ego defense, ego reassurance, and why physicalism, even if it were philosophically sound, would certainly not be a completely neutral metaphysics based purely on facts. It certainly has a host of psychological wish fulfillment motivations behind it.
Just a few more questions. In More Than Allegory that you published in 2016, you say that a lot of religious myths are actually true, and this inner storytelling helps us. So what's an example of a true religious myth?
When I say actually true, I don't mean that it's literally true. Let's make this distinction right on the outset. I think interpreting religious myth literally is basically killing it. It's just as bad as dismissing it as untrue. Because a literal interpretation flattens the religious myth. It makes it so provincial and pedestrian. It makes it lose all of its depth, all of its nuance, the subtleties through which it attempts to convey a message that cannot be captured in a direct analytical formulation. That's the power of religious myth, and that's exactly what you throw away when you interpret it literally. Then it becomes just a story, an absurd, unrealistic story. I think the religious myth is true in the sense that it is a symbol that points to an aspect of reality that is really true, but which cannot be corralled into direct, positive, analytic statements. In other words, cannot be corralled into a literal model. It transcends the boundaries of logic, transcends the boundaries of conceptualization as far as our cognitive abilities allow us to develop.
When I was reading that, I was thinking about the story of Adam and Eve, and that them having to leave the garden of innocence and kind of unconsciousness and go out in the world is kind of an allegory for how we have to experience to become self-aware. So that is that an example of a religious story that is pertinent?
That would be an example. And of course, the beautiful thing about symbols is that they have multiple valid interpretations. Otherwise, you wouldn't need them. You would just provide the interpretation that is true, and you'd be over with it. The beautiful thing of the symbol is that it has these extra dimensions. But certainly one valid interpretation of the myth of the fall, and it's the one I personally resonate most with, is that the fall means the rise of self-reflection. The development of our ability to not only experience, but to know that we experience. When Adam and Eve took a bite from the apple, from fruit from the tree of knowledge, actually. It's not an apple, it's the fruit from the tree of knowledge. When they took a bite from it, they realized that they were naked. Well, presumably, they were experiencing their nakedness all along. It was an experiential state. But only when they took a bite from the fruit of knowledge, from the tree of knowledge, did they realize that they were naked. What is that? That is metacognition. The problem is that once you become metacognizant, you begin to suffer. Because once you become metacognitive, you learn that you're going to die, you know that you weave the story that you're a limited human being, that there are that many things that you cannot do. You lose contact with the present, you begin to live in the past and all of its regrets, and the future and all of its anxieties. That's the cost of metacognition. It's very valuable. It allows us to develop a level of consciousness that would be impossible otherwise in nature. Otherwise, we would be immersed in the currents of instinct, like a leaf in a tsunami, without really being able to raise our heads and contemplating what's going on. Metacognitive consciousness gives us that ability to stick our heads out of the tsunami, of the flow of water. Oh, okay, this is what's happening, and that's very valuable. But with it comes suffering. The suffering of regret of the past, the suffering of anxiety about the future. And that's why we were expelled from the garden. We could no longer live in the blissfulness of the present moment, like the other animals in the garden. We were expelled, and we had to toil the ground. In other words, we had to suffer because we acquired the knowledge of the gods, the ability to metacognize. That's one way of interpreting it. I think there are many other valid ways. And even if you put them all together, they would still not exhaust the symbol. Because otherwise it wouldn't be a symbol. Otherwise you wouldn't need it. You would only need a dozen stories, and you would have exhausted it.
Mm-hmm. So you majored in, your Ph.D. is in computer science. What led you to do this philosophical work?
I worked with artificial intelligence many years ago. And when you work with that, you're always wondering about consciousness, because we could see in principle multiple avenues for emulating or replicating the functions of mind, what mind does. We thought we could at least in principle replicate most cognitive functions, so to say. But why would these functions be accompanied by experience? Why would there be anything it is like to perform those functions from a first-person perspective? What would make a circuit of opening and closing switches not only perform a certain function, not only process data in a certain way, but feel something as it processes data in a certain way? And I could never wrap my mind about that until I realized that the problem was related to an unexamined assumption I was making. The unexamined assumption was that something in the configuration of that circuitry would generate experience, and that without that something, experience would not exist. Once I realized the hard problem of consciousness, I very quickly realized that it was an artificial problem that arose out of an unexamined assumption. I realized that the circuits I were building were just the extrinsic appearance of certain cognitive processes in mind at large, in the universal consciousness, that they were in consciousness and not consciousness in them. And that's what led me to philosophy. Mm-hmm. Although I have been studying philosophy since I can read, but that's what really heightened my interest in philosophy and led eventually, after several years, to the series of books I've written now.
And then how did your family get from Brazil to the Netherlands? That's a long trip.
My family is a Portuguese-Danish family. Kastrup is a Danish name. I left to complete my education. I lived in France and Switzerland. And from Switzerland, I came to the Netherlands as a very young man still. But I've lived most of my life in the Netherlands. If there is one home for me, I have relationships in with many countries, so to say. My birth country, the countries of my family, and the countries where I've lived. So all in all, it's like 7 or 8 countries now that I have some direct connection with. But the Netherlands is my home. It's the country where, If I'm in an airplane, I'm exhausted, I'm like, oh, I really need to go home. What comes to my mind is the Netherlands. I do not have any other home. Brazil is an abstraction. Portugal is an abstraction. Denmark is an abstraction. France and Switzerland are great memories, but home is the Netherlands.
So you speak Portuguese, English, French, German, Dutch?
I speak 3 languages fluently enough to have an intelligent conversation or write an essay. That's Portuguese, English, and Dutch. The rest, I survive.
Très bien. Okay, I'm wrapping up here. In the face of the global warming, climate change, the increase in autocrats, growing inequality around the world, knowing what you know about the universe, are you hopeful or pessimistic about our human survival?
Oh, the survival of our species, I'm very optimistic about. There are always Inuits, there are always African Bushmen who, whatever happens, they have the skills to continue to survive and walk this earth. Even if we wreck the planet, some of us, the Aboriginals in Australia, some of us have the skills and have the connection with the planet to continue to walk this earth. I'm certainly extremely optimistic about the planet. Even if we wreck it, give it 1 million years, which is a blink of an eye, and it's all good again. The planet's not going anywhere. Even our species is going to survive. The question is, will our culture and civilization survive? Or, as Noam Chomsky likes to put it, will organized human activity survive? There I'm pessimistic about. I think there is so little time left before the point of no return that I do not think we can turn this Titanic in time to avoid the iceberg. So I think the name of the game now is to plant enough seeds for those that survive to build upon.
What's the book that you're working on now? What's that about?
I have a book that's coming out the end of March or beginning of April. And release dates are different in the UK and in the US. That's the one you just mentioned, The Idea of the World. But I have written that book more than a year ago. It just takes time in production, all the pre-marketing that publishers do. It's 9 months of pre-marketing, so it takes a while until it's available, until all the pre-orders are in. The one I've been working on for the past 5 months is an interpretation of Schopenhauer's metaphysics. Arthur Schopenhauer, the 19th century philosophy, is very well known for his ethics, for his pessimism, for his lively and robust writing style. But his metaphysics has historically been dismissed, especially by analytic philosophers, but also by continental philosophers. People talk about Schopenhauer's pessimism, but nobody talks about his metaphysics, his understanding of the world as will and representation. And upon reading Schopenhauer very carefully, I realized that a lot of what he's saying is what I'm saying now. And I thought I found a predecessor. I found somebody who 200 years ago, almost precisely, The World as Will and Representation was published in 1818. Somebody who anticipated some key points of what I'm saying today. And to my horror, when I read the secondary literature about Schopenhauer, in other words, what philosophers wrote about what Schopenhauer wrote, I was horrified by what to me is a blatant misinterpretation, a blatant and perplexing lack of understanding of what the man was saying, which in my mind was so clear, especially because he's so verbose. He says the same thing multiple times over in different words, with different examples, different analogies, different ways of explaining. I was perplexed how anybody could misunderstand him so dramatically. People who think that the will is not really consciousness. We have to expand the sense of what he meant by the will. No sense. The will is what we call today consciousness. It's just that what Schopenhauer called consciousness, today we would call metaconsciousness. Same conflation that Jung made, which was very common in the 19th century. Nietzsche used the word consciousness also in the sense of metacognition. So there's a lot of historical context for you to recover the meaning of that word for Schopenhauer. So I'm writing a book now trying to clarify in detail what I think, what I'm sure, but I can't claim that, otherwise it would be arrogant, what I think Schopenhauer meant, and trying to make sense of his metaphysics and rehabilitate his metaphysics, explaining it in modern terms, according to the little patterns of thinking that are popular in today's analytic philosophy, and rehabilitate his metaphysics. So that's what I'm working on right now.
And what do you do for fun in the face of work and research and writing and girlfriend and cats, all of that?
Girlfriend and cats are very important.
Yeah, that's true.
A big part of my personal time is them. And this home, I love my home. We have a home vegetable garden. We produce 150 to 200 kilos of food every year. It's my girlfriend's. My girlfriend is an artist, but her hobby is the garden, and I sort of tag along with her on that hobby, which I think is very enjoyable. I very much like contact with nature. Whenever I have an opportunity, I go walk in the mountains or I go to the sea. I have my favorite spots. I love a region of Germany, which is only 3 hours from where I live, called, I don't know the name in English. In Germany, it would be the river Mosel. I don't know the name of Moselle in English, maybe?
I would say
the Mosel Valley.
Yeah.
It's a valley with a lot of historical significance, a lot of tradition, lots of great white wine, Riesling white wine. And I love that part of the world. I go there to walk in nature and drink wine and enjoy the 15th, 16th century little towns that are everywhere there. I love Austria, Tyrol. I love Switzerland, the mountains. I have a relationship with Switzerland because I used to live there.
Yeah.
And I love the North Sea coast of Belgium and the Netherlands and Denmark. So that's what when I have the time, that's where you will find me. But I have very little time because I work full time as a corporate strategist. That's how I earn my living. That's how I pay the bills and have this house. Then I read and write a lot. I have all kinds of other activities. I help out with a publishing house. I'm co-director of a charity organization, which I never said in public. It's the first time I'm saying. I ain't saying any more details about that because it's nothing that needs to be said. It's something that gives me personal fulfillment, and that's all there is to it. I have a gazillion of activities that are not really hobby, that are sort of second, third, and fourth jobs. But contact with nature is what recharges me. Right. And contact with my girlfriend and my cats.
Have we left anything out that you think is important for people to know about the new old paradigm?
No, I think we've covered pretty much everything of significance.
Okay, thank you so much. I really appreciate you sharing. I'll send you the link to the YouTube.
Thank you for having me. It was